Before this, the talk was really awesome. Um, I would just like go deep into it once because we're here talking about startups. One thing you mentioned in your talk was about commanders, military, and cops. This, me working in startups for a while now, really resonated because when you mix these three different types of people, they don't really gel well together and it causes a lot of issues. How do you think startups should optimize or while hiring, this is a hiring problem, how should they think about personality types or what should they look for in teams at different stages when the company goes from, let's say, early stage pre-seed to Series A to when they found PMF to now Series B, Series C, like they move from commandos to military to cops. What should founders take care of while hiring folks? What is it that you've learned building three companies, scaling engineering teams, which you think matters?
Yeah, I think, the pattern that has worked well in Silicon Valley, there is a saying that most successful companies were actually built by people. Most of the employees in most successful companies came straight out of college. And this is like a very repeated pattern and you have to ask why. Why is that? Most of startups are just like dominated by people who just came straight out of college. And it's because, there's a certain level of moldability of like you can pick whichever role and that's just like natural to you. In fact, when we hired at Rippling, we would go to colleges and like maybe get like 30 people, in a batch. And on the very first day, I set expectations that, this is a lot more military-ish or like late commando-ish. And there is not going to be a lot of guidance. Nobody is going to give you the map. And in fact, deliberately, the onboarding session would be, I would give them a bug. Like I would give them a real bug and tell them to solve it in the code base. There is no explanation of the code base, no documentation. They just know how to run something. Now, if a computer can run it, you can run it. Fix the bug. Right? So when you go through that, you kind of like set the expectation, hey, dude, like things are crazy here. There's a crazy amount of chaos here. And you have to set that expectation early on. And that's probably one of the reasons why, most successful companies are actually built by very, very young people who can be molded into like whatever role that is needed. And then when you go to the cop stage, you can bring in specialization. You can bring in specialists who are really good at one particular thing. They might just like optimize your database like crazy. You can go bring in that guy. He might only know how to run Kubernetes. You can bring in that guy. But in the beginning, in a startup, building a startup is like the birth of a baby. It goes through a cell division process. Okay, so we all come from a stem cell, which is undifferentiated. It can divide and become a ear, nose, whatever, right? So in the beginning, the early people are like undifferentiated stem cells. Like the founders, like, Parker is doing sales, I'm doing sales, I am sort of building product, he's talking in detail about like which button should go where, like that is coding too, right? Like, so, the early stages of a startup are extremely undifferentiated. They go through cell division and founders hire people like themselves. Across different companies, the hiring criteria of like, if you go to a founder and ask, who do you hire for? They'll describe in many statements that say, I'm looking for someone like me, So it is a cell division process and, you're like looking for people who lack differentiation or specialization. So by the time, someone spends a 10-year career at Google, they've like become too specialized and they're not good to inject in startups at a very early stage.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah. So another question I had was about sort of building the tech for the startup, because initially you're the only one who's building the tech, right? Maybe 3 other people. But when you want to move fast, you'll hire a bunch of engineers. But for moving fast, you'll incur a lot of technical debt, which is because writing bad code or using the wrong things for the whatever problem you're trying to solve. How do you optimize for that? How do you make sure that the technical debt is actually manageable? Because right now, with the advent of a lot of AI coding tools, the debt is increasing in general. So how do you optimize for that?
How many of you guys are engineers, software engineers, who write code? Okay. How many of you guys work in a company where you think the code doesn't have technical debt or it's like an amazing code base. Right? You think so? I guess you are the only guy in the company, I suppose. It doesn't have technical debt. So, I've never seen an engineer who I've hired who come in and says like the code base is awesome. And like no matter how much time you invest in it, it'll never happen, right? So oftentimes, technical debt is like another way to say someone else wrote it and he wrote it in a way that I wouldn't have written it. First I think the general answer. So there is a general answer and there is a specific answer. The general answer is, if someone complains about technical debt, this is my answer. It's like, you don't have technical debt, you just have an understanding debt, right? Its problem is you, not the code base, right? So that is usually, oftentimes 90% approximation is the correct answer. People perceive technical debt where there is an understanding debt. This is totally true. Like, for example, my friend reports to Elon and he heads the autopilot team. And, when someone is like, someone new is just asked to write in the code base, when someone is fired, there's no context transfer, he's like leaves. Like Elon says, like, you suck, you walk, and, that's it, right? There's no context transfer and stuff. So, often the correct answer is, look, a computer can run it, you can run it. So there's no debt. Computer is not complaining about debt. You can't complain about debt, right? Like, so often that's the first order correct answer. The second order answer, does it mean any code goes? Then it gets too extreme. Any idea taken to an extreme is kind of dangerous. So the second order answer is, there are only like, this is an opinionated view that I have as like, top coder number one in India. Like, I have a specific opinionated view on the code base, which is there are only like two first principles things you need to take care of in the code base. One is name things correctly and organize things correctly. That's number one. By that you mean like a good code is like a story. Okay, you're basically saying, Prasanna gave a talk about startups, and then you open about like open one level, it goes into like 3 nodes, which says, he gave insight about this, like, first order summary. And then you can open another node and it shows, it expands. So it's organized like a tree structure where, at each level you have the right summary, right? So name things properly and organize things in a tree of an expanding tree. Like that is how, you build a good code base. That is what good code base is. And then bonus points if you can organize the tree the same way your org chart in the company is organized. So that is a good code base. So that is one. One is name things well, organize things well. The second thing is don't repeat yourself. Code shouldn't repeat. In my sort of 15 years of building software, I think those are the only 2 rules. There's like no other rule. Now, let's say there is a violation of these rules. How do you solve it? When do you pay the technical debt, right? So there also I have a little bit of a contrarian view. My view is you don't pay it. I never pay technical debt. I treat code debt the same way I treat financial debt, which is you just compound the equity faster than you compound the debt, right? So, if my startup is growing at like 100% year on year, or like, if my code base, like new code is being produced at a certain rate, it just automatically becomes de minimis, right? So in general, my opinion on like technical debt is like, I don't, my strong opinion is you should not spend time solving technical debt. You should, often there is a way to say this function is deprecated. You solve it in a directional manner. You change the vector, and within like 5 to 10 minutes, you can sort of put parts of comments in the code base which say this is deprecated, don't call it anymore, or like organize it into a file, just like move things around so that the vector of damage doesn't compound. And if you stop the compounding, that is enough. So that's how I deal with it.
I think I have a follow-up question on this. So I heard at Rippling, engineers are tasked not with improving system architecture, but solving business needs and problems. And the founding team had early on set up like a monolithic architecture on top of which engineers had to work. So as an engineer myself, we all kind of feel proud on thinking about new system architectures designed to do stuff more elegantly. But yeah, so Rippling had a really opinionated way of saying that, okay, we are hiring the smartest engineers. They want to work on problems which solve business needs. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, So rippling, one of the things that you get when you do the same thing for the second time is you get the benefit of hindsight of like what failed before and like, what you should not do. And Zenefits was all of these architectures that rippling was not. People were trying to build their own services. People were, some code people wanted to write in Python, some code someone would want to write in Node. And then, when you're building a 7-in-1 product whose value prop is integration, if you're having like all these services running around in like different languages, it's a mess, right? So obviously we sort of sat down and asked, okay, like integration is the product that we are selling. How do you integrate? You sort of keep it dry, keep it in one language, be very opinionated on the architecture and the code base. And the only thing, we sort of get in the best engineers and the best architects, we go hire them, we pay them the most, and then we tell them, you're not supposed to work on that. I know you can do that, but here you're not allowed to work on that. Here you need to solve like business problems of the end user, and there is an everyone uses only this stack, and everyone uses only this way of doing things, and that's how we did it.
That's really awesome. I really feel engineers are the folks who are problem solvers at heart, and it feels nice to write new architectures, but at the core of it, we're all solving problems. Do you have an example of how maybe an engineer actually solved a business problem because he was tasked on this and not the engineer circle jerk?
Yeah, I mean, like if you've taken it out, what else is left? It is to solve business problems, right? And and that's the job of every founder, is to focus your resources on what matters, right? So at the core of it, what is your job as a founder? A part of it is actually a capital allocation job. You are betting that you can beat the S&P 500. Why should the investor give you money? Because you are betting you can far outperform the risk-free rate, the diversified rate. The diversified rate is what occurs when you just let anyone do anything and you're just taking the index, right? So, your tasks with a specific job of capital allocation or talent allocation within your company into working on the highest order important bits of what you think your insight is.
Right.
So that's our job, is to like prevent engineers from doing random engineering things to like, allocating them on whatever matters the most. And then, you take out all the noise and you keep sort of pounding on the 1 or 2 highest order bits that makes a difference to our business.
Makes sense. So how do you get good engineers to work for you? And in this case, because you have to lay out a lot of constraints, like for example, the monolithic architecture, okay, you have given this problem, this is the constraint, solve it now because the person is smart enough. But I think that's possible when you sort of have the funds to get the best of the best, right? So how do you get the good engineers to work for you when you don't have the funds that match the market salaries? I mean, as a founder, as you said, your job is to tell a story. So how do you make sure you sell a story to a hyper-technical person while saying that, hey, this is not the pay that you'll be getting, that's a market salary, but this is a bet that might get you a lot of money post-which?
Yeah, I mean, so some of what just works is, people work for bosses they like. A lot of hiring decision is very personal actually. It's like, they like the boss, they like the story, and then that's why they join the story. And the smarter people are, they also can really evaluate the opportunity. So at Rippling, on the first day I tell engineers there are 3 hierarchies of value, okay, and you get compensated based on where in the value chain that you land, okay. Like there are people in Rippling, who are making $1 million a year, and there are obviously that they're like really rare, like XYZ founders or something, right? I mean, they're not making $1 million a year in cash, it's the stock options, right? Now, what does the value chain look like? The value chain is, at the lowest level, you're really great at technology. I can give you like a hard technical problem and you'll go solve it. You'll know exactly how to do it. And when you send me a pull request, I'm confident in you that I can curse over it and click the merge button without a ton of back and forth, right? That is the base level. If you're not good at that, you should not be in Rippling and like you should be fired, right? Like, so that is sort of the base level. And like within that, there is room for growth, right? You can be better at that in like many different ways. There is higher amount of ambiguity you can handle and so on and so forth. The second level is product. If I tell you this is a customer pain point, like, how do you sort of solve it? Where do you put it in the UI? How do you communicate effectively with the user in a concise way that, how do you organize this communication, where in the user communication in the product do you organize this particular feature that you're shipping, what's the most elegant way to do it. So that's the product, that's the second level, right? And then the third level is like strategy. Strategy is like, these are all the set of user problems. Which one should we solve? Which one should we not solve? Which one should we never solve? What does the competition solve? How do we stand? Right? Like that's the third level, it's strategy. People who can operate at that level are actually pretty valuable. If you really, so those people exactly know where to push the button. Where is the point of highest leverage? So that's the third level, which is strategy, right? Now, if people are like good at these three, then they're already very valuable. They're great single players. They're like amazing sort of single player commandos that you can hire. Now, there's one level above it. It's called sort of sales vision. Basically, you have a concise opinion of why something matters and what you should do, but can you translate it into buy-in to others? Can you grow the Ponzi? Now those are the guys who are taking home $1 million a year kind of checks. They can actually grow the Ponzi. They're sharing my load. They can hire the best people, they can tell the story, and they can make the thing happen by itself.
And also a thing I've noticed is whenever leaders get hired from one company to the other, the question they're asked is, how many people can you pull with yourself? How many people under you trust you so much as a leader that are ready to change shipboard? There was another question. So I think everyone here, like engineers, startup founders, have probably read the Lean Startup. What is not discussed, I think, popularly is the fat startup thesis. I think Rippling was a fat startup. Do you have insights about that you wanted to share?
Yeah, again, I was once a big believer in the Lean Startup thesis. There was a time when, I thought, startups are about iterative experiments. You try something, it works or it doesn't work, and then you try something else. And I've not seen that succeed a lot. It usually, when people mean lean startups, they are usually meaning a lack of insight. They usually mean they don't have anything that is so contrarian that it's worth betting big on. They're like, look, even I'm not sure, let me just try it out. And like that doesn't tend to work. It's already a signal that you don't have the fundamental ingredient of a startup, which is an insight. What is an insight? An insight is something that you understand, but nobody else understands. And, do you have strong conviction on the insight that you can go for a long time, delaying gratification, delaying feedback from the market to exploit that insight? So, oftentimes you don't need to delay. A lot of times you can sort of go get feedback from the market fairly soon, and, you can compound your insight. But sometimes, the insight takes a big build, and, you might need to delay. Oftentimes, if you remove the recent period of the internet, mostly products had 18-month launch cycles. Like an iPhone had an 18-month launch cycle, right? So, or the word that we use today had an 18-month launch cycle or 24-month launch cycles. That was usually the game that we were playing. Now the internet sort of lets you very quickly sort of go to market and test things, which is very valuable. But that does not solve for lack of insight.
Makes sense. So let's say for example, you turn 20 again tomorrow, right? With all the knowledge that you have, but let's say you're back at the point financially, right? If you had to build an MVP for a startup and scale it, what will be your steps? Step by step, how would you do that? Because you're an engineer at heart, right? So how do you switch from being the engineer to a founder?
So first thing that has happened is capital has stopped being a constraint. That is a very important change. That I was there early when that happened, and that is the wave that we've all been riding on. It used to be to start a company, you need to raise $10 million, spend 6 months building something. Like that used to be the world. And it changed with the internet driving down prices to start companies, where you don't need a ton of money, you just need to support yourself. Now, it has changed even further, where you can actually drown in money. Like the monetization on the internet has gotten extremely powerful now. Everyone has a credit card, and in crypto, money flows through you. So basically, software by default is monetized. Like, if you build a tool, people just put their credit card in, or people just use it and crypto flows through it. So internet has become extremely monetized. There used to be a time when, look, Facebook can be started by Mark Zuckerberg on a ramen diet, but then he still needed to keep raising money to expand his server farm, and then he needs to take a long time building a Facebook or Google and then finally monetizing. We are no longer in that world. Monetization is happening from day one. So as an entrepreneur, if a product is working, you're often just drowning in money. I think the biggest thing is venture capitalism, it's the venture VCs who are suffering. A lot of companies in my portfolio, they don't raise a second round, especially the most successful ones, they just don't need to raise at all. They raise it because that's how we used to do it. It's sort of founder inertia. But, the revenue growth is so strong and so steep that what are you going to do with money? It's just happening all over again and again and again right now. So I think the game has shifted a lot, where, founders are truly in control. If you build a product that's good, internet has the credit card and the money to pay you, and the compounding curves are so steep today that very quickly, you're just drowning in money, and it just makes no sense to raise any money. We are entering that kind of an abundance world. We're not fully there yet. We're still stuck from the hangovers of the past, but you already see that in the best companies. Obviously crypto is a crazy example of that. Companies are completely unfundable, and then they're the most valuable companies in the world. It just goes from extremely unfundable, they tried to raise $10 million, nobody gave them any money, to they're now worth $10 billion in 6 months. The change happens in 6 months. Popular examples of this is a company called Jupiter, a company called Polymarket, a company called MetaMask, basically everything. Everything in crypto sort of goes through that. You're insanely invaluable, I won't even give you $10 million, to the company has a public token trading at $10 billion, right? And there is nothing in between. There's no space for a VC to put money into this. So venture capitalists are really suffering. And oftentimes in all these companies, founders just raise one round, and there is no second round, and I'm seeing that happen in a lot of my portfolio companies. The best ones just don't need capital. It just doesn't make any sense. So as a founder, capital is no longer a constraint, and if you build something great, and you can just monetize it and make a living. And obviously there are massive exponents that are hitting right now. The world is the most elastic in a century. Everything is changing. Right now it's the best time to be an entrepreneur, because there is so much elasticity in the world. If you read history long enough, there are some periods in history, there is 20-year, 30-year periods in history where the world is insanely elastic, and then the world solidifies actually. So if you look at the time right now, I would sort of compare it to the early 1900s. When it was the Gilded Age, humanity suddenly discovered steam engines, electricity, cars, aeroplanes, and there is this famous speech by, I think, Roosevelt in 1929, where he says, I think we've entered an era of infinite prosperity and poverty is solved forever. And, that's how it looked, at that time, 1929. And he timed the top perfectly. In 3 months, that was the top for 20 years. Society really collapsed after that. But that was the period, early 1900s. You got the Edison, you got the, you got all these people getting off ships, coming with nothing, and cornering massive parts of global trade. You have the Rockefeller. You have the, all these people just this sort of exponent, You have the Henry Ford. None of these people had any sort of money or whatsoever. They just had an idea. And the world was so plastic and elastic that they could become the richest people in the world. We are sort of at that phase. I think we still have a long way to go. Right now we have some very powerful tools that are going to fundamentally rewrite humanity. Obviously AI is a big thing, is a big deal. With AI you have to reimagine everything, right? You have to reimagine, when you walk, should the doors open? How should the mics work? Maybe that mic should just be turning around and focusing on me. Why are we still holding mics? You can just reimagine everything that you're using. How should shoes work? You can sort of fundamentally rewrite the fabric of society in a way that people thought of rewriting how societies are built when electricity was invented. So when electricity was invented, you could build a microwave oven, you could build, a dishwasher, a washing machine. There was a platform. Right now we're that with AI, we're that with crypto. Crypto is a completely new platform. For the first time in 75 years, this is something that people don't understand. I think it is actually the most underrated exponent that people don't understand. For the first time in 75 years, the cost of energy is going down. And it's going down exponentially. And human wealth was always heavily tied to, the cost of energy and how much energy we use per capita. And for the first time in more than 50 years, the price of energy is going through an exponential drop because of solar. And the solar technologies are really pushing it down. So we're going to enter a phase of extremely abundant energy. We're all going to use 10 times more energy right now. We're all going to be flying very quickly if the society allows. The friction is always social acceptance more than technology. But right now we're entering a golden age of technology to fundamentally reimagine everything with these powerful tools.
Makes sense. So what are certain, let's say the steam engine hypothesis that you just gave, do you think there are certain steam engines brewing the tech ecosystem right now with regards to AI that young developers can work on and build stuff? I mean, an example I might think of is maybe MCPs that have just launched. Do you have any other in mind, and how do you identify those?
I think you look for exponential curves. And you look for how rare an event is. So, again, it goes back to the same thing. We are rare event collectors, right? So, how rare of an event is it that you're able to talk to a computer and it can reason, right? Now, that is obviously once in a new species was born kind of an event, right? That is a pretty big deal. It is an extremely rare event. And with that, you're going to reprogram everything that we use in society. That's totally understandable. The problem with that is it's also obvious. All the explorers are there, rightly so. So now you might need to think through second order effects where there is not as much competition. So that you can play two games, which is you run the fastest and get the gold. Everyone knows there is gold there, you run fastest and get the gold. That's one game some people could play. Especially the ICPC guys or programming contests, competitive people, you just run fast and grab the prize. That's a perfectly fine game for them to play. For most other people, it's not. It's winner take all. The fastest mover will just grab it. And then, you get all these people building AI agents all over the place, which goes nowhere. Because dude, everyone knows it. You want to AI agent accounting, everyone knows it, buddy. There's no insight there. So then you have to start seeking, there are two options if you're caught in that. If you're sort of playing the AI game and it's too crowded, there are two options. You have to differentiate, you have to go lonely. So there are two options to differentiate. One is you stay in the compounding curve for long enough to find an insight. So, it's an exponent, it's still early, so you just stay around until you find a unique path that people are missing, because the exponent is strong. If you stay around for a couple of years, and if the market itself is growing 100% year on year, we used to have this thing at Rippling where, someone who joined 6 months, who's been at Rippling for 6 months is a very senior guy. Because, our team is, 4xing every year, right? So if you've been 6 months, you're 75th percentile senior than most people who are there, right? So, large exponents have this effect that, just because you just stayed there for a long time, you're way more senior than anyone else. because the whole space is growing really fast, right? So that is one way, is to just hang around and look for an insight and differentiate with that. The second way is to chase second order effects, which is, okay, A is happening, one is you can go and take AI to optimize how deep research is being done, which is like first order, extremely first order, high competition, or build better models like high competition, right? First order. Or you can sort of imagine second order, which is, well, okay, AI is an exponent, and Starlink is happening, that is an exponent. Space travel is happening, that is an exponent. At these intersections are there some things that you can build. So for example, one thing we were discussing with the crowd is hardware startups are fundamentally different now. Because with Starlink, every hardware can just be connected to the cloud all the time. And with AI, it can just be very intelligent. So all you need to do to make that mic intelligent is basically put a Wi-Fi receiver on it, like a Starlink receiver, and then talk to an AI on your phone and say, hey, can you please make the mic move wherever there is noise, and then the AI from the cloud can just move the mic. So you don't need to build. We used to build hardware where we bought the mic, we bought an actuator which moved it, we wrote some code to move the mic. That's not how hardware startups are built anymore. Right? So now you're sort of going to second order. You're going far away from what is directly using AI to when two different exponents are mixing, you have a different thing that you can do. So again, you have to sort of go and explore new territories that are slightly lonely. I mean, that is kind of the job.
Yeah, another question I had, sorry if you had a question, interrupted, was how to find the problem that you should not build on. Because, as a founder or an engineer, you always want to build things because it's a high, right? When you write the code, you push it and it starts working, it's a high. But how do you figure out, okay, this problem is absolutely not worth solving and will cost the company more than the high that you'll get while building it?
Look, as an employee, it's very different, right? As an employee, basically, the company, either you're a highly autonomous employee and you really understand, you're able to climb up the layers of tech to product to strategy and all that, or the founder needs to correctly allocate you into the most impactful things, and he does the job. So it's not an employee question what you build. You have to sort of seek what is highest order value. Either you can do it, or sometimes it's not in your job description and founder needs to allocate you. That is his job description. So this is more a relevant founder question. Hey, look, I want to build this product. Is this the right thing to build? I think there are some general patterns of what works. And the first pattern is that everybody should think it's a bad idea. And especially the person you respect the most thinks it's a bad idea. That's the sort of student beating the guru, which is the cause of all science progress. So, this happens all the time, over and over, right? For example, OpenAI was a YC research spin-out. And Sam Altman was fired for working on OpenAI, right? Paul Graham called him and said, I gave you a YC, you're burning my money on this, YC research shit, what are you doing, right? Leave the role, give it to someone else. And Sama said, okay, I'll just put 10 million of my own money, it's not YC money, and then that's how OpenAI got started, right? Everyone thought it was a stupid idea, including me. And it is one of the most valuable companies in the world, right? So, the pattern, one of the basic patterns is people should think it's a really bad idea. That's what builds, extremely important companies. But then there are certain patterns for why some things are worth betting on. The most important one is there needs to be a strong, underrated exponential current underneath. So, Sama was like, yeah, PG doesn't get it, but look, there is this curve where if I put this much money, it becomes this smart. And I've tested this curve at different points. It is perfectly plotting. I just need to throw more and more money at it. It's getting smarter. So I'm just extrapolating the curve I don't know whether this curve will stop or not, but I trust the exponent. There is just enough data here that I just trust the exponent, right? So one of the common patterns is, you're like early to an important exponent and you just ride it for a long time. So that is an important pattern. And oftentimes you do need to believe in something based on your life experiences that other people just don't believe in. Even if you explain to them, they would disagree with you. And I disagreed with Sam Altman, in the early days of OpenAI. It was crazy to me. And I've hired, I've competed with engineers with them for hiring, and like there are many people who joined me at Rippling. They did well either way, but they would have also done pretty well had they gone to OpenAI.
I think last question here is, what have you observed in American founders, which Indian founders can also learn from? I think I have one anecdote, is the American mindset of bigger pies or abundance mindset, and us in India coming from the scarcity mindset. It really shows, like coming from the business where you have family businesses, the business is owned by the family, and even when an external person comes and changes the business around, he's still not part of the company's success. He's just paid a salary. I can see the same trend in Indian startups. It's slowly reducing, but compared to when you work for an American founder, the open-heartedness or the free play where he would trust you with equity as an early engineer, etc., because it's either go big or go home. And at the start, there's no scarcity mindset involved. Like, do you have any other insights I think Indian founders here could learn from?
Look, I think that is, you have to, look, anyone who joins startups, it is supply demand, it is market dynamics. It's not founders have big hearts, small hearts. 100%. It is supply demand. Now, the guy who joined me as employee number 3 or 4, he was ex-YC founder. He could have easily raised money for his own company, and there would be people who would have written the check, including me. And, and he was making $1 million a year at Dropbox before he came and joined Rippling. And, he was getting paid. He didn't even ask what his salary was. His salary was $140,000 per year, So he was getting paid like a tiny fraction of that. And he never asked what the number was. He didn't spend even one back and forth arguing what that number should be. And all the back and forth was what the equity number should be. That was the only back and forth that was happening, So people somewhat get what they deserve. In a market dynamics, like it show me someone else who would be like arguing, like negotiating like that. You get what you negotiate for, right? And he just saw things more clearly than anyone else. And in India, again at Rippling, we paid above market cash, but on the equity side, like people got very little to no equity. The early engineers. And then what typically I've seen happening is, after a year of like people performing really well, like those star performers got like a lot of equity, right? Now, because in a year the company would have 10x in value, you might get like a lot of equity, but like a lot of equity at a lower base, right? Right. Now, why is that? It's not that, I'm less generous or like I'm racist or whatever. It is just that's what that guy is asking for. I don't set the rules. I'm just trying to survive. My goal is for my company to survive. I give people what they ask for, right? Now, if he says, give me so much cash, give me all this much equity, then that's not the market for me. He's not my only alternative, right?
Right.
So there is a market that is setting the prices, and I'm a participant. I'm not a price setter, I'm a price taker. And if you participate beyond what the market is setting, you're an idiot, not a generous person. You have a resource allocation job.
100%.
You need to allocate resources to maximize the odds that your company succeeds. So, if you can get someone for 1% and that's the market and you paid 3%, you're an idiot, not like, a generous guy. You could have taken that and like used it to raise more money and like compound the Ponzi more. You just didn't do it.
Makes sense.
Makes sense. Cool. Thank you so much for doing this, Prasanna. We can wrap the fireside here and then we can start with the pitches after a little bit of setup, right? Makes sense. And the
I think
question- yeah.
slightly zooming out, right? Like let's up level that. That question is like a deep question.
So I would just correct so the thing I was trying to say was, it's not that the founder is being generous. It is also that
They
in
go
my
after big
experience, I've seen a lot of smart Indian engineers let's say, have a bad experience and then work with this really awesome founder who probably always I'm not trying to be racist, but yeah, and they really have this positive experience where they see that there are no hierarchies, they're in the same game, playing the same game. It's like more cultural. Yeah,
that makes sense. So let's slightly answer a question that you didn't ask, which is something actually that's a very important question, which is go out of the employee and go into the founder itself, right? The ambition level of founders are different, or like the outcomes that you see in India versus the US is different, right? Now why is that? And like again, if you slightly zoom out, that's a very interesting question. That's a very important question. You kind of like slightly zoom out and ask, okay, look, if you look around the world, there's a small 30-mile radius called Silicon Valley, right? And it has produced 20% of the S&P 500. Like that small area where you can sort of drive in that city, that has produced 20% of S&P 500, like $4 trillion of value. And, the world is really big. Like what is special about the 30-mile radius, which has produced, captured basically all the value. And it has produced 50% of all the GDP growth that we've experienced. Basically half the GDP growth has come from that tiny area, right? Why is that? And Peter Thiel sort of asked this question: what are startups limited by? Are they limited by opportunity? Are they limited by talent? Is it limited by capital? Like for example, in the dot-com boom, the conventional opinion was India would do really well on the internet. Internet is like pro-India, and China would suffer. Because Chinese were not globalizing, they knew only Chinese, they were not able to build globalized products, and India was, and for a while the Indian GDP was completely dominated by software. Like we had $100 billion worth of value created in India based on Infosys and Wipro and all these companies, which completely transformed India. Like it's no small deal. But you just play 1 decade later, we're like looking back and say, wait, what happened? China has like done extremely well in tech. Trillions and trillions of value capture has occurred there. And it's not that they learned English. They just continued to shut down the borders, and they just kept all the equity in the internet. They kept 100% of the equity on the internet. The Google of China, 100% China owns. The Facebook of China, 100% China owns, right? So now in a winner-take-all world, when the opportunity existed, when the network effects existed, when the opportunity existed, Mark Zuckerberg showed up to take it in China, right? The same thing happened in Russia. So now you look back and you see the losers are kind of like India and Europe, which actually embraced the globalism but couldn't be the winner in a winner-take-all market. Now Europe is like so anti-tech right now because they're so sore about losing this stuff. And India has become very protectionist to protect the in-house tech, right? So that's where we're going. So again, zooming out, why is it? So what is sort of the bottleneck in creating startups? Why is it that a disproportionate portion of the wealth got accumulated in that 30-mile radius? And my sort of opinion on this is the bottleneck to creating value and wealth is actually belief and trust. So again, as I said, we are building a Ponzi scheme. I'm going to sell it first to whoever would be willing to believe in me first. Right. And if there's a feedback loop of believers within a certain geography, I'm going to sell there first. And if I need to be close to my customers to get every edge that I can get to be a winner in a winner-take-all market, so I'm going to be right next to my customers in Silicon Valley where they would buy Rippling. I cannot start a Rippling in India. These guys won't buy it. Right. It's not that I can't build it. It's that ecosystem of belief where you can spin the first level of the Ponzi doesn't exist. And it's a feedback loop. It's a network effect problem. It is so because it has been so.
That is true.
So one thing I realized more recently, that it has changed. The best place to build a Ponzi right now is on the internet, on the blockchain. Now internet has curated some of the most people willing to believe and made them very rich. And their wealth is all in crypto, they are completely willing to believe. And that is where the fastest adoption happens today. So in some sense, I think, that center has moved from perhaps Silicon Valley into a distributed crypto system. But again, AI is really centralizing. So, we've sort of gotten back some of the Silicon Valley stuff. But again, belief is so central to creating change in society. So for example, if you think about, look, who's the greatest entrepreneur of our generation? It's like Elon Musk by all means of many generations, right? Now for Elon Musk to fly a rocket in space, what all did it take? It sort of took, he almost destroyed his entire net worth. He compounded for 14 years before he could get a rocket to space. And, he worked all day, all night. It was his childhood dream. So, if you take the extreme limit of how much force and effort it takes to make a change happen in the world, that is SpaceX. That is basically Elon Musk. And I do not think there was an experiment behind. That is the exception to the rule where all great successes had an experiment behind. And I've been thinking about what's the experiment behind SpaceX. I can't find one. I don't think there exists one. So it takes an Elon Musk, who's the greatest entrepreneur of not just our generation, of the century, to create a wave that's big enough by pushing every bit of water by his own hands. Now, the genius, it took this much effort to create that technological breakthrough to make it happen. Now count the number of companies which go to space, number of different rocket companies which go to space, number of reusable rockets that exist today. There are I know at least 10. What happened? Are these guys did they apply as much effort as Elon? Are they as smarter than Elon that they caught up in such a shorter period of time? I don't think so. What simply happened, is this dude from IIT Madras just looked and said, oh, it's doable.
Elon valued the market.
What?
He valued the market. Now the market, he opened up a market and now people
just believe they can do it, man.
Yeah.
They can see it happening, they see how it's done, they think they can do it. And it happens again and again and again. OpenAI, it was built so much against the crowd. Look at how much competition it has right now. When humanity invented nuclear energy, the nuclear bomb, it was an extremely hard project. But within a decade, 10 countries had it. Same thing about going to space. It was a monumental project that the America sort of set foot on the moon. Now that is a 9 sigma event, that a species is leaving the planet, right? When a 9 sigma event is happening, you are supposed to think it is such a rare event that it's going to occur only once. But within the next decade, it's happening again and again and again. So the fundamental limiting agent to rate of human progress is actually belief and trust. Right? If people believe they can do something, that is 90% of the job. That is what Elon is fighting. Is the lack of belief, not in the market, but in his own lead engineer, who actually really believes. His lead engineer is taking a big pay cut to believe that that he can launch a rocket. But even he doesn't believe enough. But the IIT Madras guy who's seen the rocket flow up a few times, his lead engineer already believes more than Elon's lead engineer 10 years ago. So belief is sort of the fundamental limiting agent, and therefore, an environment of believers really compounds your edge, and in a winner take all markets, it sort of really helps. So I think that's where India has been at slightly behind in terms of being able to think big and be the winner of the winner take all. But I do think the center of gravity on maximum belief perhaps has shifted into the internet.
That's true. Makes sense. I mean, it almost feels as if like Elon was the one who poured all of his money to sort of make the market, and that was the exponential drive. So in let's say other examples, for example, for India, I think it's kind of, at least history says, it's the VC's job to make the market and create the exponent. For example, Zepto. I mean, if the capital wasn't in, I mean, of course, like Zepto guys are brilliant. I mean, they figured it out. But if the capital wasn't in, the market wouldn't have been created because it's an unknown thing. So do you think even that is some sort of a 9 sigma event that, let's say Zepto, like 5-minute delivery, nobody has probably thought of it, at least in India. What do you think about that?
Again, I think Zepto is definitely like a function of capital markets, but I also think usually, but not certainly, Zepto and Uber are somewhat of an exceptions to that. Usually you can trade off time and capital. Usually you can just go slower and then make your thing work, okay? But different projects have a different sort of starting energy. At Rippling we have to burn 10 million to start the project. At Uber and Zepto, to create sufficient liquidity in one small place, you do need a lot of starting energy.
Yeah.
But oftentimes in technology, you're surprised how little starting energy it takes. You can still trade off time for capital. So the biggest counterexample, look, it is true that Zepto and Uber need to at least crack liquidity in a micro pin code to be able to test the thesis of profitability. Once you crack the micro pin code, then you can just like expand based on cash flows, right? If it's a profitable model, you can just cash flow expand. You don't need the VC to create the market.
Yeah.
You only need the VC for the very first round to test that in the micro geography. Once the liquidity is created, is it profitable or not?
Makes sense.
Right? So it doesn't take that much capital, but it takes some capital, right? Now, I have a counter example which says it doesn't even take that much capital to even tell, you can still trade off time for money. So the ultimate example of that is basically Y Combinator's biggest success story. It's called Airbnb. It's an insane network effect business. It's a global network effect business. It's basically, its target is like tourists. They're going from countries to countries. So like, these tourists need like liquidity spun up in all the countries at the same time for them to be a retained user in Airbnb. So it's an insane network effect business. And it has an insane cold start problem, which is why it took them 3 years to cold start it. It was the longest time ever. A startup has been sort of like, this kind of network effect took a long time to really cold start it. And, but they were able to trade off the time, and, it did get cold started. Another example is like Polymarket. It was a really hard cold start problem, but there almost no capital went in. Capital didn't go in, but you were able to trade off time for money.
Makes sense. Maybe it was like once you figure out the way to incentivize the network nodes in between, I think that's where it sort of pops, and that's when that's why it took 3 years for Airbnb to figure out. Maybe they changed something.
See, that story, I'm still myself not clear. I was there when it happened, but like it is very confusing. Like I understand why it's a very hard problem, but I don't understand how they were able to crack it without a ton of money.
Makes sense.
It is just a series of like a series of like good luck events were strung together to make it happen. That's the same thing for Polymarket. It was hanging around for a long time, and then a couple of important things happened together. There was the elections, and then there was one more thing that happened together, and then it sort of got traction. So it's just like random walk. In a random walk, sometimes monkeys type a Shakespeare kind of a thing. If you make the monkeys press keys on a keyboard long enough, sometimes a Shakespeare novel comes out, right? But I'm joking, obviously. I don't fully believe in it.
Exactly.
But I'm shocked that they were able to trade off just with time and crack the network effects without capital, when the conventional belief is you need a lot of capital to create the liquidity.
Makes sense.
Yeah, end to end, I would say I think we all kind of agree that Silicon Valley was like the chamber of belief, which allowed any founder with any belief of building something to go there and be surrounded by focus groups of people who also believed. We also need small societies like this, and that's where startup societies come in. think we have one in Mumbai called Proxima. This is exactly the role where you're surrounded by founders who also believe, and you're constantly in touch with them, and that's what allows you to also kind of turn off your logic and just believe in the idea and move forward. So that is it. Make friends here. A lot of founders here. That's all.
Move to Bangalore.
Move to Bangalore, yeah.